All right, folks. Hi, my name is Mark Kohler. I am the Senior Vice President at Good Judgment Incorporated, and delighted to finally be here with you today, if only virtually, on behalf of Event Horizon Strategies and Good Judgment Incorporated. I'm happy to welcome you to our Future of Foresight seminar. Today's seminar is occasioned by the publication of a great article in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs. It's called A Better Crystal Ball, the Right Way to Think About the Future. And in short, that article talks about smart, creative ways to combine scenario planning and foresight on the one hand with forecasting on the other hand. Foresight and scenario planning is perhaps a little bit an act of imagination, an effort to identify uncertainties that are driving towards different futures and combine them in smart and disciplined ways to come up with a set of plausible futures, plausible worlds that we might be traveling into. Forecasting, on the other hand, is a little bit more of a deductive process where we try to, looking at all those futures, identify which one or which ones are the most likely ones to appear. So there's a kind of qualitative, quantitative dynamic and a really fun tension between those two approaches to trying to see more clearly what's coming and what we need to be ready for. Nobody knows more about these than our panelists, the co-authors for the Foreign Affairs article. And so delighted to be with them today. On the one hand, we have Dr. Peter Scoblic. Peter is the co-founder of Event Horizon Strategies. He's a senior fellow in the International Security Program at New America, and he is a fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Welcome, Peter. Give us a little wave. There's Peter. And we're also delighted to be joined by Dr. Phil Tetlock. Dr. Tetlock is the co-founder of Good Judgment. He's the Annenberg Professor at the University of Pennsylvania and holds appointments both in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and in the Wharton School. Dr. Tetlock is the author of Expert Political Judgment, a great book that I first read when it came out in 2005. And it's just been reissued with a fantastic new preface. And I think it's worth rereading just for that preface alone, if not for everything else. And Dr. Tetlock is also the author of Super Forecasting. We'll turn to them in a sec. I just want to say we will be monitoring the chat window, looking for any questions or comments you have. And in the second half of our seminar today, we'll tackle as many of them as we can. And with that, Phil, may I please turn to you and invite you to open today's seminar and maybe tell us a little bit about the promises and perils of long-term forecasting.
Well, I think most people have the intuition that predictability falls off as a function of time, but how fast it falls off is hard to estimate. And it's pretty clear that how fast it falls off is a function of domain. There are some domains in which we're pretty comfortable taking it on faith that experts know what they're talking about 2, 3, 4 billion years into the future. We're pretty confident that the sun, we know astrophysicists think they know a lot about solar life cycles, and that it's very likely that the Earth will be incinerated by the sun in the next 2 to 3 to 4 billion years. There is an optimal forecasting frontier, though, even for astrophysics. I mean, they're not sure whether the universe is going to continue to expand forever, it'll fizzle out, or whether it'll reconverge and go out in a bang. So there are different theories. So I don't know exactly where the optimal forecasting frontier is in astrophysics, but it makes the point that there are some domains within which we're willing to take it more or less on faith that the experts can see fairly deeply into the future. Climate change is a much more topical example. Probably most people in the audience think that climate models, at least to a rough order approximation, are right, that there's a warming trend linked to changes in the chemical composition of the atmosphere, and that by 2100, the global surface temperature is going to be between 1 and 3 degrees centigrade warmer than it is now. That's an ambitious long-range forecast. And other domains, well, demographics, there's a certain amount of predictability there. Although, there's probably a substantial minority of people in the audience believe that life expectancy is going to increase moderately quickly in the 21st century, perhaps reaching into the 90s by 2100. If the more optimistic Steve Pinker types might believe that also per capita income and other indicators of well-being will increase substantially by 2100. So it's not as though we don't have beliefs about the long-term future. We do. Empirically, when you try to assess how accurate people are when they make claims about the future, long-term and forecasting tournaments, the longest I've ever measured is 10 to 25 years. And one of the things you find is that the average forecasting accuracy, or the median forecasting accuracy for the types of questions that are used in political economic forecasting tournaments, it tends to fall off as you go 1 year successively into the future, up to about 5 or 6 years. And by the time you reach 5 or 6 years, you're getting pretty close to chance accuracy. So if you were starting off with a moderately good, say, Breyer score after year one, it would fall off maybe by 20% from year to year, putting you in the dart tossing chimpanzee Breyer score range of 0.5 to 0.7 when you're moving out into the 5 to 10 year range. So there is clearly a degradation of accuracy. Now, even in the political economic domain, though, there are people who argue that it's sometimes easier to make long-term predictions than short-term predictions. In the climate domain, for example, I think most climatologists who subscribe to the official climate models would argue that they can do a better job predicting how warm the planet will be many years out into the future than they can next year, because there is a certain amount of random variation in climate. We could have an unusually cold year next year, but if you're on a long-term trend line for anthropogenic warming, that's not going to work out. You'll be able to get better predictions in the long run. I think Schiller has made a similar point with respect to financial markets. Predicting the market's going to be higher 10 years from now is going to be easier than predicting whether it can be higher tomorrow, and so forth. So there is, uncertainty clearly does increase the deeper you try to see into time. Forecasting tournaments are usually thought of as being fairly short to medium term. Scenario planning is usually thought of as being longer term. That's the traditional division of labor. Nobody exactly knows where to divide that line, but that I guess would be the conventional wisdom.
If forecasting bumps into these obstacles in different domains at different times, what can we do, Peter? Help us solve that one.
Well, I think it's useful to start off by making the contrast that you did at the very beginning between foresight folks and forecasting folks, because a lot of people who engage in foresight, and there I'm talking about scenario planners and others, will listen to any talk of prediction of even short-term events as just being nonsense, that it's not the right way to approach the future. We can't put meaningful probabilities on the sorts of one-off events that we see in politics and certainly in business as well. But obviously we can, and that's what Phil's work has, very convincingly shown. And, part of the question is, well, where is this, risk uncertainty frontier that Phil is talking about? And maybe, I don't know if we have the capacity to throw up that slide with that continuum, but this is a useful way that I've found of thinking of things, which is, drawing on the work of a guy named Frank Knight, who was an economist in sort of the interwar period. And I will not delve too deeply into Frank Knight, but he drew this distinction between risk and uncertainty. So risk being, a set of known outcomes that you can attach what he called scientific probabilities to, but really frequent as probabilities to, and futures that you can't do that with, and you can only sort of estimate outcomes subjectively. And beyond that, you have a set of futures that perhaps you have not even imagined at all, let alone being able to put probabilities to them in any way. And I think what both Phil and I are trying to do is take that bucket of things that we call the future, that encompasses ignorance, uncertainty, risk, moving towards certainty, maybe sort of the astrophysics examples that Phil talked to are sort of the closest that maybe we get to certainty, and sort of shove all of those things rightward. So yeah, so in this slide, you can see you've got ignorance kind of on the left, you've got certainty on the right. And what we're trying to do is push elements of the future, phenomena in the future that we want to know something about, out of the realm of ignorance so that we actually have imagined them, through uncertainty, where we're kind of, making, very subjective probabilities, and toward risk. And the closer we get toward risk, the more we can engage in calculation, and the kind of quantitative approach that Phil's done and what his work has done is really advance that frontier. And what I'm doing and what other scenario planners do is sort of deal with the bucket of stuff that is left to the left, and how we get our hands around that. And it's tempting when facing ignorance and uncertainty sort of to throw up your hands and say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. Tom Schelling has a great quote that I love, that the one thing you can't ask a person to do is make a list of things that he hasn't thought of. And scenario planning can, by identifying sort of these critical uncertainties and driving forces, help our imaginations sort of serve as aids to our imagination, so that we reduce the number of things that are in the ignorance bucket, and help sort of map uncertainty, such that we can navigate it more readily. I understand the instinct to say we can't really know anything about the far future or deeply uncertain domains, but I think that's neither true nor useful. And I think scenario planning helps us through that. And then when combined, as we discussed in the foreign affairs piece, with forecasting, we get quite a powerful combination.
Peter, can you develop that a little bit more? So we can have a foresight activity, a scenario building activity, which generates a wide set of plausible futures, but we all operate in companies and in government, in resource constrained environments. So we cannot practically prepare for all possible futures. So what do we do? You've identified a constellation of places we might end up, but I only got this much money. What do I do?
Yeah, so this is the thing. The weakness of scenario planning, or one weakness, is that it paints sort of too broad a panorama of the future. Even if we've put some guardrails around the future, not anything is possible. And sort of by using the standard of plausibility, we can say, okay, these are a set of things that maybe we should be more focused on than others. That still leaves us with an enormous set of possible futures. And they're not useful unless we can connect them, as you say, to decisions in the present. And I think there are sort of, three tranches of approaches you can take. The one is to develop what some people call robust strategies. So strategies that would serve you well, no matter which of these far futures came to pass. So, by way of like individual personal analogy, I could scenario plan out, 20 years from now, the future of my life or my career. In all of those, it would make sense for me to like take care of my health in the present. That would be a robust strategy that would serve me well under any circumstances in the future. And there are organizational equivalents, sort of, basic organizational hygiene, things, that may seem obvious, but that not all organizations do. Where you have to make, kind of high stakes decisions that would preclude you from making other decisions because they're difficult to reverse. It can make sense to maintain optionality and to hedge. But the third tranche, and this is where I think we get into the interesting stuff and we get into what Phil and I wrote about, is can you make smarter bets about which of those futures is more likely, which of them is emerging, or what elements of them are emerging? And scenario planners do not put probabilities on far out scenarios, because the more detail you add to any far future scenario, the more conditions you put on something, the less likely that particular thing is to come to pass. The probability sort of approaches zero. But what we can say are, well, if that future were emerging, we'd expect to see certain things in the near future. And what we can do is identify what those things in the near future would be, so that we've then brought them into the realm of things where, Phil's work has demonstrated that forecasting can be useful and we can put meaningful probabilities on them. And we sort of develop an early warning system of sorts, both through the forecasts and then through seeing whether the events that are forecast actually come to transpire.
I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Peter, but or Phil, but this is what we might call a cluster of signpost questions that are pointing out which way we're headed. And Phil, you've done a lot of work in this area, both with the U.S. government, with the IARPA project, and then on some separate research. Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on signpost questions and clusters that can illuminate where we're headed? I think you're on. There you go.
The first thing I would say is that there's been an unnecessary polarization. It's not just the political polarization in the country, but even in the epistemological realm, we're thinking about the future. There's an unfortunate polarization between the qualitative and the quantitative people, and they have their stereotypes of each other. That one side is evasive and sloppy, and the other side is artificially precise and detached and trying to have physics envy. So there are these stereotypes. It's really not helpful. So one of the things that I thought I really enjoy, I always enjoy working with Peter, but I thought it was important for the foreign affairs piece to bring together two people who approach the problem from somewhat different philosophical orientations and methodological orientations, but who have respect for each other and like each other. So I think there's the value of interpersonal chemistry it's very important. I mean, I've met many scenario people who just dripping with disdain for forecasting tournaments. I've met many more quantitative people who are dripping with disdain for the scenario people. And it doesn't have to be that way. So for example, one of the earliest question clusters we developed was linked to Davos, and the Davos scenario about the world is on a trajectory toward a fourth industrial revolution driven by strong forms of artificial intelligence that will cause major dislocations in white-collar labor markets by sometime in the mid-21st century. That's the scenario trajectory. It's a nosebleed level of abstraction. You can't possibly feed that into a forecasting tournament. But what you can do is you can ask very specific, you can decompose it. Sometimes we use the word Fermiize it. You say, well, what kinds of things would you expect to observe in the relatively near to medium term future if we were on that scenario trajectory? And when you pose that question, things start to pop up. You say, well, I wonder whether AlphaGo is going to win the World Go Championship in Seoul, Korea. That was going on, I think, in 2015 or 2016. And lo and behold, it did. And it's gone on to do a lot of other amazing things, including most recently solving a major protein folding problem. So that's a sign of the advance of strong AI. We might also expect driverless cars to be picking up passengers in major American cities by the end of 2018. I don't think that happened. You might expect the Watson system developed by IBM that won the Jeopardy games to be beating the world's best oncologists in cancer diagnosis tournaments. That also didn't happen by 2019. So there's a number of things. Some things happened, some things didn't happen. Most recently, an AI beat an experienced pilot in a simulated dogfight in a DARPA Air Force competition. So, I mean, it's a mixed picture. In some ways, the technology is advancing sort of in a manner that would be consistent with the scenario trajectory of fourth industrial revolution, strong AI driven. In other ways, we're lagging. And I think that's, you get a more useful, a more nuanced portrait than you would either by asking the questions alone in isolation from each other, in which case it would just be sort of one question after another. It wouldn't be interesting, but it's organized by a story, a scenario story. And you have the benefit of a narrative projecting out in time, a coherent narrative, and you have questions that are linked to that narrative. I think that's a more natural way for people to think, and I think it facilitates more timely belief updating on major issues.
Hey, let's put up the two slides on the China scenario that are described by Drs. Scoblic and Tetlock in the article. And Peter, would you want to walk us through this? This is a copy of what Dr. Tetlock just talked about. And here you have some visuals. Go ahead and talk us through it if you would.
Sure. So I should, give credit where credit is due. The sort of four futures presented here come from a long and thorough report that the RAND Corporation produced this summer on Chinese grand strategy. And that report concluded with estimating the potential futures China could find itself in the year 2050. And you can see that they sort of talk about a triumphant China in which it's engaged, accomplished all of its goals. Ascendant, they're sort of on their way there. Stagnant, exactly what it sounds like, and imploding, at the opposite end of the spectrum. And these are kind of, useful buckets of futures to consider. But you're also left with the problem that if we're thinking about, the China's possible future as encompassing rise, fall, or anything in between, how does that enable us to make better decisions in the present? And the only way that we can really do that is, yes, there are some certainly robust strategies that we could pursue that make sense no matter what transpires in China. But if we can get a sense of which Chinese future is emerging sooner, we can make smarter decisions today. And that's where the question clusters come in.
Next slide, please. There you go, Peter.
So here you can see a set of questions that would help us update our beliefs in the near term about which direction China was headed. And you can see that it encompasses everything from potential GDP growth to cultural influence to air quality in China as a proxy for the health and happiness of the population, I suppose. International influence within the United Nations and control of islands in the South China Sea that are disputed. And so I think there are several interesting things to note about these questions and what can make them powerful as a cluster is, first of all, they're rigorous. So they're very clearly defined signposts. They pass what Phil has called the clairvoyance test. Once if one of these things comes to transpire, there can be no argument that it actually did come to transpire. You also see that they're not geared toward confirming any particular hypothesis about the future, that China is ascendant, for example, because often we get the most information and we can engage in the best belief updating through the search for disconfirmatory evidence. So these kind of tackle the problem of confirmation bias that stems from a lot of attempts to look into the future. And then the third thing is they are not correlated with each other. Some of them may be slightly correlated, but you can kind of put those in tranches. But GDP, South China Sea, cultural influence, these are sort of a range of uncorrelated things, that much like that reduce the risk that we focus on the wrong signpost in the present. We've sort of diversified the portfolio of things that we're looking for, and therefore reduce this danger that we fixate on something that is particularly conspicuous, but perhaps not that important. Which gets to a point that I find really interesting, that we often have difficulty telling what is important in the present. A great recent example was when the Nobel Prize was awarded to the scientists who sort of published the original papers on CRISPR. In 2012, very few people paid attention to that development. And of course, it's turned out to be a remarkably important one. So sometimes we don't assess what the most important signposts are in the present, and having a set of, a broad set of uncorrelated questions reduces that risk.
So the foresight and scenario activities that that Peter has written about and that Peter leads can generate a wide range of plausible futures, and then through disciplined thinking, we can kind of narrow them down a little bit to some that are more or less plausible. The more deductive sort of forecasting activity that Dr. Tetlock has been working on for a couple of decades now can begin to attach probabilities to signpost questions that are pointing to one future or another. That is, if we're going to go into one of the quadrants on the right in this 2x2 matrix where the Chinese economy is strong, we would look at forecasts about Chinese GDP. And if they're higher and suggest that a strong, robust Chinese growth is what we're going to see in 2021 and 2022 and 2023, then that means we're over on that side, and that these other two futures are somewhat less likely. And that's great. And that's what this article is about, is combining these two methods to give early warning, planning time for decision makers in the private sector and in government. And I wonder, Phil and Peter, if you have any thoughts on and I believe we have a question from one of the panelists, but any thoughts on how policymakers and how decision makers in the private sector are already using this hybrid quantitative qualitative approach, and maybe have some examples to share? Peter?
What I have experienced, certainly since the publication of the article, is a tremendous amount of interest in combining these, but an awareness that it has not been done effectively. You may have better examples, Phil, from your work of combining scenarios with forecasting. But the thing that I've heard from a variety of quarters, in Pentagon, corporations, even sort of NGOs, is there is some familiarity with the concept of scenario planning. It's not necessarily, or there's a lot of familiarity, but it's not necessarily rigorous scenario planning. But the idea of combining it with predictive, like with probabilistic forecasting, with what people tend to call prediction, is not a connection that has always been made, in part because of the philosophical differences that Phil talked about. The people that you bring in to do scenario planning explicitly say up front, what we're doing is not prediction. But I'd be curious to hear what Phil's experiences are with combining these things.
Let me turn your question into a counter question, Peter. So in the news recently, I saw that the Chinese have just constructed a village in Bhutan, in the Himalayas, close to the India-Bhutan-China triple border. It's a move out of the South China Sea playbook, essentially. It's changing the facts on the ground to justify expansionist claims. That's news. That's a news item. It wasn't in our question cluster, but if it had been, I assume that the subject matter experts would have judged that to be more indicative of an expansionist, somewhat dangerous China. It would also, I assume, if let's say the Chinese GDP numbers come in really strong, and they do some more forceful things in the East China Sea and the South China Sea and in the Himalayas, How much should you update your view about triumphant China? To what extent do people in the policy community who subscribe to who think that the triumphant China scenario trajectory is the most likely of the 4 scenario trajectories that are in that 2-dimensional space? To what extent are those people more likely to say we should be prioritizing the formation of an Asian NATO that spans India to Vietnam to Japan? Peter, question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And how much do you update, right? I mean, this is a Bayesian question that I would throw back at you, but I'll try to tackle this one first. And I think that, to the extent that you have schools of thought about the future of China, to put it in sort of the terms of the psychological literature, you've effectively formed a focal hypothesis. You've essentially created a prediction about the future that you expect simply by telling ourselves a story about a potential future. We become subject to explanation bias, right? Simply by recounting a narrative of how China might be ascendant, we come to believe it more. And then we seek out evidence to confirm that thing. So are people who are in the sort of ascendant China camp, the more hawkish camp that sees expansionist tendencies on the part of the PRC, going to see their beliefs reinforced and perhaps even update more in the face of of Chinese actions? I would say yes. And then the question is, well, what would make you believe that you're not right? And let's go looking for that disconfirmatory thing and see if that exists as well. And that's where I think the clusters become so important, is that they serve as this check on our natural biases to look for information that confirms pre-existing beliefs. And it's a nice sort of judgmental counterpoint essentially to our instincts, and that's what I think is valuable and can allow for sort of more judicious updating, I would say, in the face of events that at the time may seem very conspicuous, and because they are conspicuous may seem extremely important, but those are not the same things. Conspicuous, salient are not the same thing as important.
Gentlemen, you wrote in your article the following: people frequently confuse plausibility for probability, assigning greater likelihood to specific stories that have the ring of truth. And Peter and Phil, you're both addressing that issue now, but confirmation bias, can we ever get away from it? Once I have a story, perhaps generated by Foresight work, can I get away from it? How dangerous is that in terms of locking me into a subjective forecast that will not actually map what's facts in the world?
I think we agree that confirmation bias is a powerful tendency in human judgment. I think we probably would also agree that, based on everyday observation, that some people are more open-minded and self-critical than other people's, and maybe a little less prone to confirmation bias. There certainly is a substantial body of empirical evidence on cognitive style that people do vary in how susceptible they are to confirmation bias, although all of us are to some degree susceptible to it. It's natural to apply a more lenient, can I believe this standard of evidence to agreeable claims, and a tougher, more skeptical stance of must I believe this to disagreeable claims. And anyone who doubts that hasn't been paying attention to the U.S. election in November of 2020. But so there's personalities factor. It's not immutable, but it's powerful. An interesting issue is whether you can train people to be more resistant to it, and I think there are some indications that that's possible as well. It's possible to create organizational climates. It's possible to create instructional regimes that help people develop the mental habits of they're becoming more aware of the standards of evidence and proof that they reflexively apply agreeable and disagreeable claims, becoming more critical, having a richer internal conversation about how they think. Learning to listen to yourself, talk to yourself. It sounds like you're going down a rabbit hole here, but the art of self-overhearing, the literary critic Harold Bloom used that in his wonderful book on Shakespeare. The art of self-overhearing is not as deeply appreciated as it should be. Your capacity to listen to yourself, talk to yourself, and decide whether you like what you're hearing.
Phil, you know, of course, that I was one of your rat lab guinea pigs during the forecasting experiment, and I remember how you and the Good Judgment team emphasized the importance of making comments when we had a specific forecast, and for me that was one way to really writing down the comment and seeing it in print in cold black and white in front of me was one way I think that got me to think more about confirmation bias. When you're sort of staring at something you've written, you can begin to worry a little bit more if it's right or not. We have a question from the audience which I think fits in here. It's about historical knowledge and historical patterns being incorporated into your assessments, either foresight or forecast, I suppose. And I guess that is that a confirmation bias? Is that an anchor? Well, it's always been this way, and therefore I'm just going to draw a tangent line and project the same. And the questioner also asks your views, gentlemen, on commercial predictive analytics products. So if either of you have an answer, please jump in.
Those are two mega questions that would take hours to unpack. I don't know. I'm glad to take a stab at the first one. I don't know if you want to take a stab, Peter, first. I'll defer to you, Peter. The order.
Well, I would just say, I mean, there is a lot that we could say about these different things. I mean, obviously, I think that history plays a role in both, scenario construction and in informing forecasts by helping forecasters develop comparison classes that enable them to form, base rates and therefore better probabilistic assessments of the future. One of the great dangers I see is in the overuse of history and the tendency that we have to adopt a single historical analogy for the moment in time that we're at. And what often tends to happen is that when confronting uncertainty, when faced with a novel situation that we don't really know how to make sense of, we look to the past for guidance, find a point that we think looks kind of similar, and saying, well, this is what we did then and it worked out all right, so let's do that now and we'll hope it works out all right in the future, has enormous dangers to it. And there's some irony. It's sort of, the more uncertain the world becomes, the more unlikely the future is to be like it was in the past, the more that we turn to the past for some anchoring point to help us make sense of the present. And that doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. The point of, by definition, novel circumstances lack antecedent, which does not mean we cannot learn anything from history. It just means that we have to be very careful in doing so and in applying it to our assessments of the future.
Right.
Thanks. I find the history question really intriguing. The commercial ventures question, I think less intriguing, but also important, especially if you're a commercial venture. But his history is very much on my mind right now on the research side. And we're trying to model how people think about possible pasts and possible futures. Peter is a key collaborator on a project that we're just starting on China. We have some other projects going on as well. But imagine, say, Russia. Imagine that you know a subject matter expert who believes that if the West had been more generous with Russia in the immediate transition from communism in 1992, if it had anteed up with something analogous to a Marshall Plan for Russia in 1992, that US-Russia relations in 2020 would be much better than they are. If you know that a subject matter expert is sympathetic to that point of view, you're probably also likely to know that that subject matter expert is going to be skeptical of policy proposals to increase military aid to the Ukraine in 2021, conditional forecast going forward. So when you crank up the microscope, one of the things you can discover, and you can actually model this with Bayes nets and other techniques, you discover that the historical counterfactual beliefs that people have about possible pasts are organically connected to the conditional forecasting expectations people have about possible futures. There's much to be learned, I think, about studying the interrelations among those propositions. I think if you wanted, for example, if you were in the business of training intelligence analysis trainees, you wanted to get people up to speed. One indicator that they're up to speed in a domain would be that they're able to reproduce the probabilistic beliefs about historical counterfactuals and conditional forecasts that different schools of thought of experts have. So hawks, doves, and owls on Russia are going to give you different answers to the Marshall Plan question. The hawks are going to say, you know what, Russia's pretty immutable. There would have been a Putinist regime one way or the other. The doves are more likely to see a tragic missed opportunity, and the owls are straddling in the middle somewhere. Insofar as trainees can become more skilled at reproducing how the subject matter experts of various schools of thought think about possible past and possible futures, the trainees are mastering an intellectual space that could prove valuable, I think, testable proposition here, in making them better conditional forecasters and scenario planners going forward.
Phil, this touches on a question that just arrived from Nadia. In the article, the authors talked about how knowledge of a topic doesn't always correlate to accuracy, that people with knowledge of base statistics did much better in accurate forecasting. What role does deep knowledge play? Maybe Phil, I know you've thought a lot about that, and Peter, you probably have thoughts about that too.
Oh, this goes back to a conversation that I had with Danny Kahneman when he was at Berkeley many years ago, and I was describing the expert political judgment project to him in the late 1980s, and his reaction was, these subject matter experts you're asking forecasts from, they're not going to do any better than an attentive reader of the New York Times. So yeah, you've got your PhD in China studies, and he reads the New York, he reads a serious newspaper reasonably regularly. And so back in 1988, that was his reaction. He was skeptical. So you could think of that as an hypothesis. It's the diminishing marginal predictive returns of knowledge hypothesis. And how quickly do you reach the point of diminishing marginal returns from knowledge in different domains? I think there are some domains in which knowledge does translate very readily into prediction. There are other domains in which knowledge doesn't translate very readily into prediction. And it's a bit like, the question we started off with about, short versus long-term forecasting and how fast does predictability fall off as a function of time. It depends on the domain. So I really would counsel being, I'm very circumspect about this. It depends on the domain.
Peter, any comments from your side of the fence?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add on to that I think, part of the difference in whether the domain knowledge is useful in forecasting is whether the domain allows for rapid learning and feedback. And so in some domains, you're able, you can take action and you get an immediate result, and therefore you're able to learn from the sort of the delta between your expectation of what was going to happen and then what actually happened. In a domain like politics, that's not necessarily true, because a lot, decisions that are taken may have ramifications that are far out, and there are a lot of intervening variables, and therefore it becomes this grand epistemological challenge to figure out whether X actually led to Y or not, and that yields less value when it comes to then improving your ability to forecast. I mean, the thing that I would say, and I would add, and I think, Phil, this is something you agree with as well, is that when it comes to generating forecasting questions, to sort of coming up with sets of things that we ought to be looking for, these question clusters of signposts, domain knowledge is extraordinarily useful. It's hard to simply take, you know, someone who is brand new to a subject, drop them into a scenario and say, well, now, if that's the far future scenario, what should I be looking for in the present that it's an indicator of? That doesn't work so well. So that is important for expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, in the super forecasting book with Dan Gardner, you know, we talk a bit about Tom Friedman and the Iraq War of 2003, and he did indeed support the invasion until he renounced it. But, you know, he putting to the side, you know, his very debatable skills as a forecaster. I think he has a wonderful flair for gisting the essence of an issue and for crystallizing creative questions. And we talk in super forecasting about, you know, whether Tom Friedman is a super question generator as opposed to a super forecaster. And the case in point was his question about Iraq, which if it had been posed prior to the invasion of Iraq, I'm not going to claim it would have changed people's minds, because people seem to have their minds pretty firmly made up. But it's a deeply instructive question, and when you hear it, you say, "Oh my God! If only they had thought more deeply about that." And his question was: is Iraq the way it is because Saddam is the way he is, or is Saddam the way he is because Iraq is the way it is? That is, I think, a beautiful condensation of the core issue, and. Yeah, so I think super forecasting and super question generating are very distinct skills, and super question generation is more tightly coupled in certainly the geopolitical domain to deep subject matter expertise.
I can certainly attest, Phil, that that I and others of your guinea pigs during the research project regularly encountered inaccuracy when trying to forecast in areas where we thought we were expert, and relatively better levels of accuracy in areas that we hadn't really worked on a lot before. So, so that's an interesting thing. I think we have time for two more questions, and a couple of them. There's one that's related. I'll start with the shorter one. And I think, Peter, this is perfect for you, given your background as a journalist. Are there ways in which journalists, social media users, and others can use these tools to elevate discourse in the public square?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think in a number of different ways, coming at it from a scenario planning standpoint. So sort of from the Foresight side of the house, I think what so often happens in journalism, and especially with the rise of social media, is that the sort of tyranny of the present becomes ever stronger, and we become very focused on the moment. And so what scenario planning usefully does is help, provide a structured environment to take us out of the present. And why is that important? Well, for decision makers, it's important because a lot of the decisions that are being made in the present, often in a reactive way, to developments that are happening sort of today, have long-term, difficult to reverse consequences. And so if you're not taking the far future into account when you're making those decisions, you're going to get a suboptimal outcome, as one might say. I also, to that point, I think that scenario planning helps us ask the right questions. So to the extent that we're focused immediately on the present, we're not thinking about the second and third order effects that certain developments may have. And I think back to a piece that journalist Garrett Graff wrote toward the beginning of the pandemic, when everybody was very much focused on, of course, what was immediately happening. And crisis tends to focus us even more on the present than we usually are. And he said, we're not even beginning to ask the right questions about the long-term economic repercussions, the repercussions about work and the delivery of healthcare and so on and so forth. And I think scenario planning can get us to better questions. On the forecasting side of the house, you know, journalism or just, you know, commentary is rife with vague forecasts of the future that don't really tell us anything. And when you see this sort of vagary, you know, my instinct has become, you know, to say, well, how do we turn that into a testable question? How do we take maybe a broad, sweeping prediction about what might happen in the future and say, well, how can we decompose that into things that we can actually look for and measure in the near term? So I think there's enormous value to be gained from sort of both sides of the house here.
Thanks, Peter. We at Good Judgment have certainly been talking with more and more with journalists during this pandemic. And on the one hand, you have the it's not impossible that a COVID-19 vaccine will be available by the end of the year. On the other hand, it's conceivable it could be in 2021, right? These sort of vague statements. And our forecasters, our super forecasters and our forecaster on Good Judgment Open have been rather more precise, saying, you know, whatever, it's 83% likely that we'll have a vaccine for 20 million or more people by Q1. And that, I think that's kind of nice if you're planning to, you know, you can look at the process, you can have faith in the wisdom of the crowd that's using best methods to generate these forecasts. And then you've got something that you can actually work with rather than it's not impossible. I think we have time for one more question, and it's a complicated one. So I'll just leave it open to either of you. But I think it's fascinating. What are the characteristics that indicate a topic is best suited for futures analysis? What are the characteristics that indicate a topic is best suited for this? And I guess the obverse would be, what topics don't lend themselves to this kind of disciplined qual-quant analysis? Phil, any thoughts?
Sure. So the first order question would be the extent to which the policy debate pivots on conflicting images of the future. So insofar as that's true, that suggests that the expected value of getting better probabilistic estimates of possible futures will feed into the policy process. The second is to what extent is it feasible to improve the accuracy of probability judgments in the domain. And you know, that's something you only really discover unless you try. So, you know, I think that they're essentially, when you're thinking about whether or not to invest in systematically in improving forecasting, foresight processes, there are two kinds of mistakes you can make. One is you can make the mistake of pretending that you're not doing forecasting when in fact that's exactly what you are doing. And that's a very common mistake, I think, in a lot of journalism and often in academia as well. The other is you can make the mistake of devoting too much time to trying to improve forecasting in a domain where irreducible uncertainty makes that a fool's errand. So those are the two possible risks that you're always balancing against each other.
Phil, just to clarify, what do you mean?
It's a client judgment call.
To clarify, Phil, what do you mean when you say you think you're not doing forecasting when you are? What are you talking about there?
I think it's very interesting that, you know, when you ask journalists and other people, when they write statements like, well, this might well happen or this could happen, they actually don't believe that those statements are forecasts. But they are, but what they are, and on any reasonable philosophical inspection, is they're vague verbiage claims about possible futures. When you ask people to translate those judgments into probability ranges, they translate into very wide probability ranges.
Okay.
And that serves there's a very useful function if you're in the public square and in public debates, and you want to sound as though you're saying something very definitive about the future, but you don't want ever to have it come back and bite you. So you make claims like this could well happen, which readers might read as 20%, might read as 75%, And if it doesn't happen, you say, ah, well, you know, I told you, I really said could. And if it does happen, you say, ah, look, I warned you about that one. So you get, it nicely straddles the divide, and you don't wind up with, you know, the awkwardness of the Nate Silver situation in 2016, where you had a 70% likelihood of Hillary winning and everybody thinking that was a manifest error.
We have another question, and it will help us wrap up. The question was, hey, what was the name of that article again? And the article is called A Better Crystal Ball, The Right Way to Think About the Future, by Peter Scoblic and Philip Tetlock. It's in the most recent edition of Foreign Affairs. I think it's the lead article in the November-December issue. It starts out with this sentence: every policy is a prediction. And Peter, I think I recognize your penmanship here, saying that no decision maker wants his or her course of action, his or her plan, to lead to unintended consequences, right? Nobody wants to. So everyone is forecasting implicitly or explicitly all the time. So I thought that was a good reminder that that even when I get up to go get a cup of coffee, I'm implicitly making a bunch of forecasts there. So I better do it as well as I can. I want to be considerate of everybody's time. We said we'd go to 10 o'clock, and that's where we are now. I'm sorry, 12 o'clock Eastern time. But with an offer for all of you who signed up, we are going to send out a link, and the link will mention a couple ideas we have for a cluster, a qualitative, quantitative foresight forecasting cluster that we'd be happy to host on Good Judgment Open, our public-facing forecasting website. We've got our own ideas, but we believe in the wisdom of the crowd. And so you can either vote on our ideas or you can suggest your own, and we'll take all that input together and we'll put together a fun cluster, something for people to play with as the holidays come up upon us. And with that, I think we're 1 minute over. Dr. Tetlock, Dr. Scoblic, thank you, gentlemen, very much for your time today. Thanks for your great article, very thought-provoking, and at least to me, really shed some light on better ways to think, and I'm grateful. So
working with you guys.
Great. And panelists or attendees, sorry for the tech problems up front, and thanks so much for joining us today. Over and out.